I'm Monty Halls, and I'm on a mission to solve some of the greatest mysteries in the world of diving.
From the deadliest dive site on Earth...
We have a convulsing diver.
...to missing treasure in an African lake.
Is there a safe full of gold?
From Japan's lost Atlantis...
It's an extraordinary sight.
...to the most perfectly preserved wreck I've ever seen. This is deep and dangerous diving.
It's a really tight squeeze
that will push me to my very limits. This time...
Wow, beautiful!
The Cornelia B. Windy 8, a wreck so pristine she gives few clues as to how she sank in 1875.
Looking down on her now, it's incredible to believe that she remains so perfectly intact.
By disappearing as she did, the Windy 8 was simply wiped from history.
We had no idea it was there. We'd never even heard of it.
There were no survivors to shed any light on this extraordinary underwater Marie Celeste.
Where in the world did they go?
How did it sink? How can something pre-1900 be that pristine?
It just left so many questions unanswered.
I'm here to try and discover exactly what did happen to the ghost ship of Thunder Bay. I'm in the National Marine Sanctuary in the evocatively named Thunder Bay.
The bay makes up part of Lake Huron on the border between Canada and the USA. In the late 1800s, the lakes and the newly built Erie Canal formed a major trade route. It was a dangerous journey, one that killed more than half of the sailors who worked on the lakes. But even by the standards of the time, the Cornelia B. Windy 8 is extraordinary. When she sank in 1875, she and her entire crew simply vanished off the face of the earth.
There were no survivors, so no bodies have ever been found. And for 111 years, no one even knew where the ship had come to rest.
Then, in 1986, Paul Ehorn was searching for the wreck of a ship called the Florida with his dive buddy John Steele, when they stumbled on a mystery that experts are still trying to solve to this day.
Hello, Paul. Very keen to hear your story.
I made the first dive. I'm about 180 foot. You couldn't see, it was dark. And I went right past the wreck. About that point, I managed to crack the zipper open on my dry suit. And I was just, let's call it and get out of here with my life. So I turned around, started to head up, and lo and behold, here's the wreck right behind me, not 4 or 5 foot away. I came up over the railing and noticed there's a board there. There was the nameplate.
The nameplate, Cornelia B. Windy 8.
We knew nothing about it.
So began an investigation that continues to this day. Local historian Pat Labadie was one of the first on the trail of the perfectly preserved ghost ship and her vanished crew.
So, Pat, tell us about the Cornelia B. Windy 8.
She was built by Thomas Windy 8 in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and named for his daughter, Cornelia B. Windy 8.
What was her primary function?
Well, she was built principally for the grain trade between Lake Michigan and the eastern ports, like New York and Boston, Philadelphia.
Hundreds of ships and thousands of lives were lost in a trade of high risk and high reward. Ice and storms closed the lakes for the winter, so by October, ships like the Windy 8 could make huge profits if their owners were prepared to gamble on making the last grain runs of the year.
Until the railroads were built, this was, major part of the American food chain.
The wreck of the Windy 8 is so remarkable and asks so many questions, it's one I've always wanted to dive. My support team couldn't be better qualified. Surface Supervisor Andy Torbett is a former military diver who can cope with any emergency we're likely to face. Rich Stevenson is one of the pioneers of wreck diving in the UK. And cameraman Dan Stevenson has filmed more wrecks at greater depth than anyone else I know.
It's a chance to touch history. If anything like that happened on land, it'd be cleaned away the next week. in the sea or in the lakes, it just stays there.
That's the bit that I'm looking forward to see the, you know, this ship in almost like pristine condition.
All I've ever heard about this is how extraordinary it is, even in the context of the Great Lakes, where wrecks tend to be really well preserved and all that. Even in that context, this just blows everyone away. And those are the questions we sort of want to answer, really, is why is it so utterly, completely preserved? And the big one, for me anyway, is the crew. What happened to the crew? You know, you don't get many shipwrecks around the world where the crew just completely vanish without trace. The investigation will take me into an area of diving fraught with potential dangers. The wreck lies at 200 feet, the very limit I'm qualified to dive to. It's 5 miles out to the wreck. Our skipper, Greg, is relying on the latest technology to find what is, effectively, a needle in the vast haystack that is Lake Huron.
That little signature there, Greg, that's the wreck.
Correct, yes.
Before we can dive, Greg needs to get a shot line onto the wreck so we have something to follow down and back up.
We've stuck a camera onto the grapple just to see it make this descent, and hopefully it'll pick up this wonderful ghostly image of the wreck as it hurtles past.
Amazingly, Greg has placed us smack over the wreck. As well as the depth, a major challenge will be the extreme cold of the lake water.
You're limited by bottom time and deep. You can only spend so long in the water before you can get hypothermic, as simple as that.
So every dive's got to count, basically.
For all of us, the descent to the Windy 8 is tantalising as we wait for her to show herself.
Surface to dawn, comms check.
Roger, topside, loud and clear.
I've dived dozens of wrecks, but never anything as immaculate as this, in such perfect visibility.
Rising in front of me was the mast, was the tip of the mast, standing upright and completely proud of the deck.
This is water! And the water still moves. This water leads down to one of the most extraordinary wrecks in the world.
It's an extraordinary sensation as the wreck looms out of the gloom beneath you, because it's a moment frozen in time. The exact moment when that beautiful boat became a beautiful wreck.
You can see the whole length of the wrecks are here.
So you're looking at a scene from 1875.
It is beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
And as you get closer and closer to the deck, you realise just how well preserved it is.
Wow.
As you carry on round, so many features stand out, perfectly protected by the frigid waters.
These hoops were used to hold the sail.
You can almost feel that if you just clipped a sail on and pulled the lines, the Windy 8 would be flying again, the Windy 8 would be off. That's the state of preservation of the thing.
This is the steering wheel. This is one of the things with this wreck. It's so eerily, utterly intact.
The intense cold means I've only just got time to check out the most intriguing mystery of all, which lies just off the stern. No trace of the 11 crew has ever been found, either trapped inside the hull or washed ashore. The one thing we do know is that they didn't abandon ship.
This is the yawl house, which would have been used as a lifeboat to try and get the guys off. It lies now, silently next to the wreck. That's the last salvation of her doomed crew.
The ghostly sight of the yawl boat off the stern, it makes you think that maybe they did try to get off that boat, but plainly they didn't.
It's extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. That's a wreck to save her. She's just beautiful.
But because she's so well preserved, the questions start piling up. How did she sink? And what happened to the crew of this ghostly underwater Marie Celeste? The Cornelia B. Windy 8, a near perfectly preserved wreck on the bottom of Lake Huron.
Looking down on her now. It's incredible to believe that she's lain here undiscovered for over a century.
Why did this underwater Marie Celeste simply vanish? Could the name of her final resting place, Thunder Bay, hold any clues? Russ Green is an archaeologist with the Thunder Bay Marine Sanctuary.
You know, the lakes, particularly this stretch of Lake Huron, is notoriously dangerous. I mean, the weather can turn in a heartbeat. There's lots of reefs and there's lots of traffic, dozens of collisions. Fog is contributing to that. Human error. We know of 100 sites just in northern Lake Huron, and maybe as many as 6,000 throughout the entire Great Lakes.
Good grief.
Yeah.
6,000?
That's right.
Oh, my word.
That may sound like a lot of wrecks, but the lakes are massive. They cover an area the size of the UK. I'm meeting TV meteorologist Paul Gross.
Hello, Paul.
Hey, how are you, Monty?
I'm very well.
I'm hoping he can explain how these massive inland seas create those instant and life-threatening changes in weather conditions that Russ was talking about.
In the month of November, for example, the lakes are still relatively warm. The temperatures might be 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius. You start getting these Arctic intrusions from the north coming down, and that Arctic air flows across these lakes. Now, an unstable atmosphere is any atmosphere where you have cold air up above warmer air at the surface.
So in effect, this almost acts as a magnifying lens, as a way of intensifying storms that already exist.
In the right conditions, these lakes can turn those storms into a monster.
That was really interesting to see that you got weather systems coming down from up north, coming up from the Gulf. It's a point that focuses all that energy and you create something incredibly ferocious. You create something that sinks ships.
So how did that affect trade on the lakes in the days of ships like the Windy 8? In the late 1800s, there were over 600 vessels competing with one another. The biggest profits were made by the crews prepared to take the greatest risks in what became known as the shipwreck century.
Was the grain run all year round?
The demand was certainly year-round, but it was only practical to ship until usually the 1st of November, when weather patterns on the Great Lakes made it too dangerous.
Was this widely acknowledged as a deadline?
Absolutely. It was so widely recognized that the insurance companies refused to insure vessels on the water in November.
And yet, the Windy 8 set sail on the 27th of November, with a journey of at least 6 days ahead of her. Most owners had already laid their boats up as winter shut down trade on the lakes. So just how much was at stake as the Windy 8 set off on that final grain run?
You can really feel the weight of that.
This is 60 pounds, or roughly a bushel.
How many of these would a vessel carry?
Ordinarily 14 or 15,000 for a vessel of the Windy 8's size, but of course she was carrying considerably more, at 21,000 bushels.
21,000, so she was, you know, well over her capacity. What would drive the skipper and the people who own the boat to take those risks?
Purely profit. Purely profit. The value of the product itself rose dramatically in November.
So you had a commodity being grown, you had a massive market here where you could sell that commodity, and in between you had this life or death route that you had to cross.
So, if she was massively overloaded, How did that affect her seaworthiness as she headed out into a highly volatile chain of lakes at the height of the storm season?
Thunder Bay's living up to its reputation and its name. This has closed in really quickly. It's not a storm yet, but it's really cold, totally overcast, and it's due to get worse.
In a frantic attempt to cash in before winter closed the lakes, the Windy 8 was loaded with 30% more cargo than she could safely carry. On this dive, I want to get a real understanding of the risks the Windy 8's owner was taking with the ship and her crew.
This is the cargo of wheat, as you can see. It's right the way to the decking. 21,000 vessels on it.
The bitter cold of the lake water has preserved the cargo for 140 years. But due to that extreme cold, I have to limit my dive. I still want to find out how that huge cargo of grain affected the seaworthiness of the ship.
This is the deck level here. Normally, the waterline is 6 or 8 feet the latest. That is a contact vessel was so heavily laden. The waterline was actually around here. And that meant as the vessel heeled over, this would have been awash with water.
If the captain had experienced fair weather throughout the trip, he might just have got away with it. And that was the big gamble he took. In the 1870s, there were no weather forecasts, so no way of knowing what conditions were going to be like.
But we can work out what the weather was like at the time, because the US Navy kept records and layered the data onto the charts after the event.
I've come to the keeper's cottage at Presqu'île Lighthouse, built 5 years before the Windy 8 sank, to meet weather historian Bruce Smith.
Hello, Bruce.
Welcome to the old Lightkeeper's house. Step on in.
Smashing, thank you.
Bruce has pulled out the chart for the very day the Windy 8 sank. It clearly shows a massive storm, which begs the question, why did the skipper set out in the first place?
I suspect this area low pressure that's now over the state of Maine originated somewhere over the central part of the United States about the time that the Windy 8 would have left Milwaukee on the 27th. Winds were likely from the east or a southeasterly direction ahead of the storm.
At that point, the Windy 8 would have had light southerly winds. But as the low tracked east, it intensified and collided over the Great Lakes with high pressure coming down from the Arctic.
So Captain Mackey set out in good sailing conditions.
That's right, but the skipper had no way of knowing that this cold air mass was in the wake of this storm.
And how cold would that have been? This is probably very key to our story.
These were temperatures more indicative of a very cold late winter day, indicative of January, February, not so much for late November. So temperatures were 10, 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit.
So perhaps this is what ambushed the skipper and the crew.
They rolled the dice one too many times.
So, she's a dangerously overloaded vessel caught in a freak November storm. It's -20 with 40-knot winds and 10-foot waves. And yet, for a ship that's been through that kind of hell, the wreck is in immaculate condition, unlike any other wreck in the lakes. I've asked Skipper Greg to take us to a similar boat in a very different condition, to see whether it sheds any light on what happened to the Windy 8.
It's a schooner, a canal schooner, same build, sank 4 years prior to the Windy 8 in 1871.
So it's going to be almost identical in terms of the hull design and...
Yeah, had a load of grain, just like the Windy 8, but met a demise completely different and is in a disastrous state on the bottom.
The wreck of the E.B. Allen lies in 100 feet of water, compared to the Windy 8's 200 feet. But despite sinking half as far, she's come off significantly worse.
You can see the blue decking. It's like the rafters of a beautiful building. But the fact that there isn't any decking shows she had a very different end to the Windy 8.
Survivors reported that the E.B. Allen sank within 3 minutes. As she went down, the pressure of water rushing into the hold would have blown the decking off. There are further clues that suggest the two boats hit the lake floor in very different ways.
This is where the main mast would have been mounted. And you can see the sheer force of the E.B. Allen hitting the lake bed as it sank. In stark contrast to the Windy-It, you can see that the mast has fallen forward. It's no longer upright on the deck, indicating that the boat hit the lake bed bow first.
And there's a final, stark reminder why the wreck of the Windy-It is so extraordinary.
This hole was the end of the E.B. Allen. This is where another vessel struck her in a fog bank.
On the Windy-It, there's no gaping hole in the hull, and she didn't founder on a reef. So how did the Cornelia B. Windy-It sink? The Cornelia B. Windy-It. She's as perfect now as the day she sank in 1875. No trace of her 11 crew has ever been found.
She's a ghost ship, abandoned to her fate.
Most people focus on the wreck itself, but for me, the fate of the crew makes this a very human tragedy.
We've no idea of their age, we've no idea of their experience level, we don't know anything about their names or indeed where they came from. But what we do know is they took a gamble. They gambled with their lives on what turned into a suicide mission.
And the decision to send them out on that mission? Pat Labadie is a local historian who's been delving into the background of the Windy-It. He's made a discovery that might make some sense of an otherwise inexplicable roll of the dice.
I'm sure it was the decision of the ship's owners. She had been acquired by new owners just a couple of months before that end of the season, and my guess is he wanted to recover as much of his investment as possible.
Do we know much about the guys who actually made up the crew?
Surprisingly little. It was an entry-level job for a lot of men, the deck crew, and there was no record of those men.
And was that standard of the age? It seems staggering to me that you can have 11 people just vanish into the immensity of the lake, and several of them, you've got no record of them, no idea who they are.
Indeed. It was very common. This was an easy place for immigrants to find jobs, and many of them, their names were unrecorded entirely.
And what was the rate of attrition?
11 out of every 17 crewmen could expect to lose his life at his work.
I mean, those odds are
staggering.
They're insane. What would drive you to take that level of risk? You've got a 60% chance of losing your life.
There were so few ships out at that time of the year. If you could get a job on one and you know, continue getting paid, it was worth trying.
But worth risking your life for? On the Windy-It's final voyage, the odds were even worse. We know from weather maps compiled after the event that the wind gusted up to 40 miles an hour, and the temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So what part did that extreme cold play in the sinking of the Windy-It? Could she have become icebound where she sank 5 miles out into the lake?
In that same storm, the schooner Favorite was caught in the ice 10 miles offshore in Saginaw Bay. And after struggling to free the ship, the crew had to abandon her, and they walked 10 miles to shore and made it safely.
Could the crew of the Windy-It have died trying to do the same thing?
So they're 5 miles offshore. So if they did start walking ashore across the ice and the ice broke beneath them, they'd end up falling into the water and drowning or dying of hypothermia.
That would explain why the lifeboat was never launched and why no bodies were ever found. Their clothing would have offered no protection in the freezing water.
It's cotton. Maybe it's oiled up with some linseed oil for waterproofing protection. Maybe you've got a canvas over this, some wool underneath, to keep it warm. But still, by today's standards, this was not great exposure protection.
Yeah, imagine wearing that at minus 30 degrees Celsius.
If the Windy 8 had got stuck in pack ice, there'll be signs on the hull, and that's what we'll focus on next.
Well, just as you're kitting up, one of the key things we're looking for here is ice damage to the hull. Any traces of ice damage to the hull. Again, the great lingering riddle is how she went down, and we just want to find out, was she holed or was she not holed?
Obviously, the hull is the critical part. You can lose a certain amount of superstructure, you can damage your mast, damage your sails, but you can still keep going as long as the hull has integrity.
Working as a team, we spread out to cover as much of the ship as possible.
What are you looking for here? A sign of scraping or scarring or anything like?
Ice has terrific crushing powers. Titanic had a hull an inch thick, and that was sheared by ice. Ice has tremendous powers of destruction.
So any damage significant enough to sink the ship would stand out.
A long 45 minutes.
So, chaps, any sign of ice damage on the hull?
The bow is clear. Where the mild current has kept the silt away from underneath the keel.
Yeah.
There's very little muscles down there, and there's no damage.
No.
If she was to hit ice or something, it'd be in that area. You would expect a plank to be sprung, or something to be stoved in, or something like that. Nothing. She's perfectly intact all the way down that hull.
It's got total integrity, isn't it? You can almost refloat her.
This only deepens the mystery. If there are no signs of damage on the Windy 8, which was only 5 miles out, how did the Favourite get iced in 10 miles offshore? At the Great Lakes Research Institute, Jia Wang has studied the pattern of ice build-up on the lakes. He shows me a map on which depth is represented by colour. The red of Saginaw Bay means relatively shallow water. The blue where the Windy 8 sank signifies deep water. Ice forms first in shallow areas, like the bay where the Favourite got trapped.
In addition to that, the prevailing wind will blow any drifting ice into the bay and pile up the ice. The ice thickness could be 1 meter, 2 meters thick.
Which is easily thick enough to support a man.
Yes.
So the Favourite was 10 miles offshore and the crew managed to walk ashore. The Windy 8 was only 5 miles offshore. Could the crew have made it to land?
No, because the wind is parallel to the shore. And any ice foam on shore will be blown away.
The storm left 40 ships icebound, but all were in the shallow waters of the bays and straits. Once the Windy 8 got out onto Lake Huron, the crew were at the mercy of wind, waves and ice-cold spray. Did that affect their ability to handle and ultimately save their vessel? To find out, I've come to the US Army Natick Soldier Systems Center outside Boston.
Hi there, how you doing, Monty?
I'm Sarah Ross.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Let's go to the Arctic side.
Up to you.
Sarah Ross helps run the facility, which tests the effects of extreme weather conditions on soldiers and their equipment.
Well, look, can I show you what we're trying to replicate?
Absolutely.
Here? This was the storm that the wreck of the Windy 8 sank in. So you're looking at temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and 40-knot winds on top. And I think one of the keys is that they were so cold and so debilitated that they couldn't work.
Well, when humans are starting to be exposed to those types of temperatures and that type of extreme wind, their cognitive function immediately goes down. So their brain doesn't really know what to do to function in that type of situation with that weather. Your body starts to naturally pull all of its warm blood into your core because those are where your vital organs are. And so while doing that, it takes away the blood from your extremities. Therefore, it's very hard to maneuver with your hands and use your fingers to do those types of things that you would need to survive.
So basically, you're not thinking straight.
Absolutely not.
And you've lost your dexterity. You've lost the ability to do the simple tasks that would take you 2 minutes normally are just impossible.
The chamber tests the very latest in sub-zero protection. But I'm kitting myself out in the kind of clothing the crew of the Windy 8 would have been wearing to see how badly they would have been affected.
We're at 8-knot winds and it's raining. So this is pretty much the conditions the Windiot would have set out in on the 27th of November, 1875.
But I want to find out what it was like at the height of the storm. And that means ramping the wind up and the temperature down.
We're at about 20 miles per hour.
You can feel the heat fleeing from your body. But it's not as cold as it would have been on the Windiot. Nothing like it. And already I can feel how incredibly unpleasant this is.
We're pushing the winds up to 40 miles per hour sustained.
The weather reports talk of 40-mile-an-hour winds on the Windiot. This is a really intense wind. So imagine the vessel doing this. Huge waves coming over the bow. Imagine being in your freezer wearing what I'm wearing now. It was in these conditions that the crew of the Windiot realised they were going to die.
So, you've got crewmen in the early stages of frostbite, trying to keep their balance on a deck that's heaving up and down by the height of a 3-story building. It wouldn't surprise me if some was simply washed overboard, never to be seen again.
It certainly helped to explain why no bodies were ever found and no lifeboat was ever launched.
And what of the Cornelia B. Windiate herself, ploughing on at the mercy of the storm, as one after another the crew perished?
The hull shows no sign of catastrophic damage, certainly the sort of damage that would have consigned her to the deep. So why didn't she just ride out the storm to be found later on abandoned? It's a Great Lakes mystery that no one has ever been able to explain.
A virtually intact ship, abandoned by its crew without launching the lifeboat, and left to sink in 200 feet of water during one of the worst storms on record.
One of the most bizarre aspects of this story is that she didn't break up as she sank. She almost appears to have been gracefully lowered onto the seabed.
Compare that to other wrecks where hulls have been torn apart, decks have been ripped off, masts snapped and fittings strewn over a wide area.
So how could the Cornelia B. Windiot have remained so perfectly preserved? I'm hoping the answer lies in here.
I've been invited to the Marine Hydrodynamics Lab at the Ann Arbor campus of the University of Michigan to meet Director Mark Perlin.
Hello, Mark.
Hi, Monty.
How are you?
Hi, welcome to the University of Michigan.
The 360-foot tank is used to simulate sea conditions to test boat designs using scale models. A wave machine at one end has been precisely calibrated to mimic conditions on Lake Huron during the storm that sank the Windiate. Mark's colleague, Dave Schwab, has gone back to the original US Navy weather charts to see how the waves would have been behaving.
So let me show you what we have.
Yes, please.
As we move forward in time, it's showing the day and the hour. We're in hour 2, hour 3, hour 4, hour 5.
Now, just
6.
to stop you there, Dave. So what
Sure.
we're looking at here is we're pushing up to 2.5 metre high waves.
Just in 6 hours with a 15 meter per second wind.
Wow, so that's a rapid change of conditions.
Very rapid.
Suddenly we've got waves that are up to there, above me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as we move forward the next 6 hours,
wow.
Now you're building up to 4 to 5 meter waves.
This is a mariner's nightmare, isn't it? It's like the devil's cauldron.
Yes. Yeah, it's where you don't want to be.
Down in the lab's workshops, a team of Mark's students have been building a 1 to 40 scale model that will be put to the test.
Okay, here we are. This is the Windiate.
That is a work of art. You know, it's really interesting to have that model representation of what we were seeing on the bottom. There's a danger that you think of it as a shipwreck and you don't think of it as a beautiful vessel, which is what it was, you know, with lovely lines and rigging. Fantastic, great work. Right, let's sink it.
The wave tank's about to start up. There's a palpable air of anticipation. We've genuinely got no idea what's going to happen. Because one of the keys here is not only is this a 1/40th scale model, it's also weighted pretty much exactly the same as the Cornelia B. Windy 8 was, with its 21,000 bushels of corn. And that's the reason it's riding so low in the water.
All that weight reduced the Windy 8's freeboard. That's the distance between the water and the deck to just 3.5 feet. So the first question is how that reduced freeboard affected her seaworthiness in the early stages of the storm.
Good grief. You can already see just these really small waves. Scale, what do you think, Mark? Meter waves?
Yeah, about that. That's what the freeboard is, right?
Yeah.
You can see him going over the hull.
And this isn't random. We're not just bashing away with a wave machine, just trying to create waves. These are replicating as much as possible the conditions over the 24 hours that the Cornelia B. Windy 8 sank. You can already see she's shipping water over the front there.
Let's do 1.5. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this will sink her. Got to let it go, Daniel. Got to let it go. You can see that thing, can't you, Mark, that with the weight on her, it's already very bow heavy. She's starting to nosedive. Yeah, because she's also got this going on now as well, isn't she? She's pitching and yawing and rolling, and the deck's totally awash now. So again, this would have... There she goes.
There it goes.
There she goes.
Actually, that looks pretty realistic.
Bye-bye, Cornelia B. Windy 8. So, Mark, has anything we've seen today surprised you? Have you learned anything?
I think it went down much quicker in the higher waves than I expected. I would have guessed it would have taken several waves before it flooded like it did. But I think they knew they were going down.
What this proves is that the Windy 8 must have sunk pretty early on in the storm, leaving no time for the skipper to try and find a safe haven.
What you've just seen there is the vulnerability of these vessels. Because remember, everything's being done as accurately as possible. So the weight that the vessel's loaded with, the scale of the waves, they just did not stand a chance.
Even with 4.5-foot freeboard, I personally wouldn't have gotten on that vessel.
That was fascinating. All sorts of very interesting things emerged, but one of the key ones was that as the waves came over the bow, the vessel sank bow first, the model sank bow first, as so many vessels do, as we've already seen from the EB Allen. The bow cuts through the water and it ends up impacting onto the lake bed, and then you end up with massive damage. It's a huge shock, all that tonnage hitting something solid. But the wreck of the Cornelia B. Windy 8 is sitting perfectly on the bottom. Something made that vessel sink slowly and settle perfectly on the lake bed.
At the Great Lakes Research Centre, Jia Wang has been doing some calculations, and he might have come up with a solution.
According to data, an ice form on the superstructure at a speed of 16 tons per hour.
16 tons an hour?
Yes.
The equivalent of 4 elephants of weight every hour in a vessel that's battling the waves anyway with an incapacitated crew. There must obviously just come a critical point that is going to sink.
Yes.
So where the Windy 8 started with a freeboard of 3.5 feet, that's going down the whole time as her weight increases. But could the same ice that sank her have preserved her?
So ice starts building up on the Cornelia B. Windy 8 and starts weighing her down at a colossal rate. But as the Cornelia B. Windy 8 started to sink, this stricken vessel, weighed down by many tons of ice, became buoyant. And then as the ice began to melt, she was held perfectly vertical and sank oh so slowly to the lake bed.
But that would have just prolonged the agony for the crew. On our final dive, I want to see whether they were making any effort to save the ship, or whether they just abandoned her to her fate.
This is the last dive on the ghost ship of Thunder Bay. Could you get a better day for it? The mist has closed in. All you can hear is the eerie moan of a foghorn coming across the water. So it's our chance to dive this vessel that was claimed by the lakes.
We're looking for any remaining clues. I want to know how much of a struggle the crew put up before they finally gave up or were washed overboard.
This is the field shop. This would have been used all the time. But the big question is, why is the handle not there?
And running along the deck, a further mystery.
This train, lying on the deck, could be highly significant.
The chain holds the anchor, and it normally remains stowed in a locker. But here it's been laid neatly along the deck.
It indicates that the crew of the Windy 8 pulled the chain out of the locker.
So, after a week of diving, how close are we to understanding the mystery of the ghost ship of Thunder Bay?
Why is the bilge pump missing? The handle. They knew they were fighting for their lives. They knew they had to get that ice off her. Did they take it off and try and smash more ice with it?
So, Mackie's sending them out onto the deck to hack and cut away ice. Something else he did as well. He got them to flake out that chain.
In preparation to try and anchor, do you think, or?
I think it was an attempt to balance the ship.
Oh, yeah.
It's just my theory, of course.
If she had a list, you mean, if she was starting to go over to one side?
Or if she was getting bow heavy, drag the chain out of the front and try and drag it to the back. And that quality of ice, which I hadn't really thought through before this, that of course taking on 16 tons in air, so that's what drove it beneath the water. But there's that instant change to that becomes buoyant and holds it in the water. And that, again, for me, is one of the really evocative images of this whole project. This sort of white, encrusted, ghostly vessel. There would have been a moment where it just hung in mid-water, suspended. That's the sort of thing that legends are based on. And so, in a way, we've dived a legend, I think, this week. The Windy 8 stands as her own memorial. But what of the men who vanished without trace? Today, there'd be inquests and boards of inquiry, but in the 1870s, life on the lakes was cheap. Were they just written off as inevitable casualties of a cutthroat business? I'm hoping the newspapers of the time might have picked up on their tragic story.
This is the Alpena Library, and myself and Pat are in the archive section, and what I'm trying to do is find any trace of the vessel. How are you getting on, Pat?
Here's one that just tugs at my heartstrings. December 20th, the Chicago Inter-Ocean. The headline says, "An appeal for a change in the customs regulations so that a record of sailors' names can be kept ashore." The Chicago Inter-Ocean is written so frequently by the families and friends of sailors inquiring as to their whereabouts. At present, we have letters from relatives of several men who are supposed to have been lost with the schooners Minnie Williams and C.B. Windy 8. But as the names of the unfortunates are not known and cannot be learned, we are powerless to answer them. And their parents, wives, children, and others interested have not even the melancholy satisfaction that certain information would afford. The last line in this article says, "Will the Department of Commerce or Congress itself make the reform suggested?" Wow.
The Cornelia B. Windy 8 has always been very significant for me personally. It's a wreck I've always wanted to see. But from what I've just learned, maybe the significance is a lot wider than that. The sinking of the wreck and the loss of those men seems to have sparked something, a great outcry that these crews were registered so people knew who they were. So maybe the men who sailed the Cornelia B. Windy 8 weren't lost in vain.